بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أبناء الطلاب وزملاء أطباء الدراسات العليا، يسعدني أن أقدم لكم هذه الأفلام التعليمية التي تتناول الجانب العملي لمادة التشريح. فنشاهد الآن هذا الشريط على أمل أن يحقق الفائدة المرجوة منه مع تمنياتي لكم بالتوفيق. يقول الله تعالى: وقل اعملوا فسيرى الله عملكم ورسوله والمؤمنون. صدق الله العظيم.
The scalp. This is the scalp. The scalp is the covering soft tissue of the skull cap. It consists of skin, superficial fascia, epicranial aponeurosis, loose connective tissue layer, and the periosteum of the skull cap, called the pericranium. The three superficial layers, namely the skin, superficial fascia, and epicranial aponeurosis, are firmly fused together. This is the epicranial aponeurosis, which extends between the frontal bellies and the occipital bellies of the occipitofrontalis muscle. This is the layer of loose connective tissue just deep to the epicranial aponeurosis. This space allows easy spread of infection and accumulation of fluid, so it's called the dangerous area of the scalp. This aponeurosis is attached laterally to the temporal line, while anteriorly and posteriorly it gives attachment to the frontal bellies and occipital bellies of the occipitofrontalis muscle. These are the muscle fibers of the frontal bellies intermingling with the fibers of the orbicularis oculi muscle. It should be noted that the frontal belly is inserted into the skin of the forehead, and that the whole occipitofrontalis muscle is supplied by the facial nerve, the frontal belly by the temporal branch, and the occipital belly by the posterior auricular branch. This is the supraorbital artery, accompanied by the supraorbital nerve. Medial to these structures, the supratrochlear artery and nerves lie. Note that the supraorbital and the supratrochlear arteries are branches of the ophthalmic artery, which arises from the internal carotid artery. The corresponding nerves are branches of the frontal branch of the ophthalmic nerve. These are the supratrochlear and supraorbital veins, which form the beginning of the facial vein. They communicate with the ophthalmic vein, which drains into the cavernous sinus inside the cranial cavity. This is the left occipital belly of the occipitofrontalis muscle. It arises from the lateral part of the superior nuchal line. This is the occipital artery, which is a branch of the external carotid artery. It's accompanied in the scalp by the greater occipital nerve, which arises from the posterior ramus of the second cervical nerve. This is the superficial temporal artery. It has an anterior branch and a posterior branch. The artery is related to the superficial temporal vein and the auriculotemporal nerve. The superficial temporal artery is one of the terminal divisions of the external carotid artery. It appears at the upper end of the parotid gland and crosses the root of the zygomatic arch just in front of the tragus of the ear, where its pulsations can be felt. The auriculotemporal nerve is a branch of the mandibular nerve. The superficial temporal vein joins the maxillary vein to form the retromandibular vein, which descends inside the substance of the parotid gland. The vein is closely related to the external carotid artery, which lies deeper to the vein, and to the facial nerve, which crosses superficial to it. This is the orbicularis oculi muscle, with its orbital part that curves around the orbital margin, and its palpebral part lying in the upper and lower lids. This is the platysma muscle. It is one of the facial muscles because it is supplied by the cervical branch of the facial nerve. It lies in the superficial fascia of the neck and is inserted into the lower border of the body of the mandible. Its fibers reach up to the angle of the mouth. It's now reflected to show the structures deep to it. This is the parotid gland. It reaches upwards to the zygomatic arch and the external auditory meatus, and extend downwards between the angle of the mandible and the mastoid process. Observe the relations of its anterior border from above downwards. This is the temporal branch of the facial nerve. It's the uppermost. This is the zygomatic branch of the facial nerve. This is the transverse facial artery, which is a branch of the superficial temporal artery. It runs just below the zygomatic arch. This is the parotid duct, running forward to pierce the buccinator muscle on its way to open into the vestibule of the mouth cavity opposite the upper second molar tooth. The buccinator muscle is covered by the buccopharyngeal fascia and the buccal pad of fat. This is the buccal branch of the facial nerve. it supplies the vaccinator muscle. This is the mandibular branch of the facial nerve. It runs over the body of the mandible. Notice the masseter muscle deep to the parotid gland. This is the facial artery and vein, crossing the body of the mandible at the anterior inferior angle of the masseter muscle. The pulsations of the artery can be felt easily at this site. The facial artery is a branch of the external carotid artery and runs anterior to the facial vein. It is tortuous, but the vein is not. The artery reaches very close to the angle of the mouth, where it gives inferior labial and superior labial branches to the lower and upper lips respectively. This is the right side, which is more deeply. The facial artery is seen running superficial to the vaccinator, but runs deep to the other facial muscles attached to the angle of the mouth. It continues up to the angle of the eye, where it's called the angular artery. It anastomoses with the supraorbital and supratracheal arteries. This anastomosis represents a communication between the external and internal carotid arteries. This is the temporalis muscle. It fills the temporal fossa, from which it takes its origin. Its fibers converge deep to the zygomatic arch to be inserted into the coronoid process of the mandible. It's covered by strong, deep fascia, which is called the temporal fascia, that extends from the temporal line above to the upper border of the zygomatic arch below. This is the masseter muscle. Notice the direction of its fibers, which extend downwards and backwards from its origin from the lower border of the zygomatic arch to its insertion into the lateral surface of the ramus of the mandible. All muscles of mastication are supplied by the mandibular nerve. These muscles are temporalis, masseter, and the lateral and medial pterygoid muscles. However, all facial muscles are supplied by the facial nerve and are called muscles of facial expression. The main facial muscles are the orbicularis oculi, the orbicularis oris, and the vaccinator muscle. Now, this is the vaccinator muscle. It's the muscle of the cheek. It's pierced by the duct of the parotid gland, and its fibers run medially towards the angle of the mouth to enter the upper and lower lips. These fibers form the extrinsic part of the orbicularis oris muscle, which surrounds the opening of the mouth. The buccinator muscle is covered by the buccopharyngeal fascia. This is the facial artery having a tortuous course. This is its inferior labial branch and superior labial branch. This is the facial vein, which has a more straight course behind the artery. This is the deep facial vein, which is a tributary of the facial vein and enters the infratemporal fossa to join the pterygoid plexus of veins. An emissionary vein passes through the foramen ovale and connects the pterygoid plexus of veins with the cavernous sinus. Remember that the facial vein drains the dangerous area of the face, which is the area around the nose. It's connected with the cavernous sinus through the ophthalmic vein, as well as through the deep facial vein and pterygoid plexus of veins. This is the infraorbital nerve emerging from the infraorbital foramen. It divides into labial, nasal, and palpebral branches. The nerve is the termination of the maxillary nerve and is accompanied by the infraorbital artery, which is a branch of the maxillary artery. This is the parotid fascia, which is an upward continuation of the deep cervical fascia. With the parotid gland reflected laterally, the branches of the facial nerve are seen as they pass forwards. These branches form a plexus inside the parotid gland. The retromandibular vein, also called the posterior facial vein, is seen on the deep aspect of the gland. It is superficial to the external carotid artery. The branches of the facial nerve cross superficial to the vein. The infratemporal fossa is exposed by removing a part of the zygomatic arch and the ramus of the mandible. This is the masseter muscle reflected upwards. This is the temporalis muscle passing to its insertion into the coronoid process of the mandible. It's now reflected upwards to reveal the deeper structures of the infratemporal fossa. Notice the nerves and the vessels that enter the deep surface of the temporalis muscle to supply it. This is the head of the mandible, dislocated from its place where it forms the temporomandibular joint. This is the articular disc which lies inside the joint and divides it into an upper and a lower compartment. This is the insertion of the lateral pterygoid muscle into the front of the neck of the mandible. This muscle has an upper head arising from the infratemporal surface of the greater wing of the sphenoid and the infratemporal crest, and a lower head arising from the lateral surface of the lateral pterygoid plate. Notice two structures appearing between the two heads. The first is the buccal branch of the mandibular nerve, which runs over the lower head to reach the cheek to supply it with sensory fibers. The second structure is the second part of the maxillary artery, as it forms a bend before it disappears into the pterygopalatine fossa to become the third part of the artery. The maxillary artery is better exposed by reflecting the lateral pterygoid muscle. This artery arises from the termination of the external carotid artery opposite the neck of the mandible. The other terminal branch of the external carotid is the superficial temporal artery. The superficial temporal artery ascends inside the tissue of the parotid gland and appears just in front of the tragus of the ear. The maxillary artery runs forwards deep to the neck of the mandible, where it is called the first part. This first part of the maxillary artery gives off two main branches, the inferior alveolar and the middle meningeal arteries. The inferior alveolar artery passes downwards in company with the inferior alveolar nerve to enter the mandibular canal together. The middle meningeal artery passes upwards between the two roots of the auriculotemporal nerve to enter the foramen spinosum. This is the auriculotemporal nerve. It arises from the posterior division of the mandibular nerve by two roots. It then passes backwards deep to the neck of the mandible. It appears at the upper end of the parotid gland, just in front of the tragus of the ear. The part of the maxillary artery deep to the lateral pterygoid is its second part. It appears between the two heads of the lateral pterygoid muscle. This second part gives off only muscular branches to the muscles of mastication. The third part of the maxillary artery is the part present inside the pterygopalatine fossa. It gives off many branches to the upper jaw, nasal cavity, palate, and orbit. Notice two important nerves passing downwards from under cover of the lateral pterygoid muscle. These are the lingual nerve anteriorly and the inferior alveolar nerves posteriorly. They arise from the posterior division of the mandibular nerve and run downwards on the surface of the medial pterygoid muscle. The inferior alveolar nerve gives off the nerve to the mylohyoid muscle, lower down near the entrance to the mandibular canal. This nerve to mylohyoid is motor to the mylohyoid muscle and the anterior belly of the digastric. The sphenomandibular ligament lies posterior to the inferior alveolar nerve. It stretches from the spine of the sphenoid to the lingua of the mandible, which guards the mandibular foramen. The lingual nerve has the corda tympani nerve joining its upper part from behind. The corda tympani is a branch of the facial nerve carrying taste sensations to the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, as well as parasympathetic fibers to the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. The lingual nerve leaves the surface of the medial pterygoid muscle and comes in contact with the back of the socket of the third molar tooth. Thereafter, it lies on the surface of the hyoglossus muscle. The mandible is elevated to show its deeper surface. This is the insertion of the medial pterygoid muscle into the inner aspect of the ramus of the mandible. And here is the lingual nerve leaving the muscle in contact with the last molar tooth to enter the submandibular region. Back to the medial pterygoid. This muscle has a small superficial head which arises from the maxillary tuberosity superficial to the lower head of the lateral pterygoid, and has a larger deep head which lies deep to the lateral pterygoid and arises from the pterygoid fossa and the medial surface of the lateral pterygoid plate. This is the end of the maxillary vein which accompanies the maxillary artery. It joins the superficial temporal vein to form the retromandibular vein. The retromandibular vein descends superficial to the external carotid artery till the lower end of the parotid gland, where it enters into the formation of the external jugular vein and the common facial vein. This is the beginning of the external jugular vein. It runs downwards on the surface of the sternomastoid muscle to pierce the deep fascia of the root of the posterior triangle, a short distance above the clavicle, to end in the subclavian vein. This is the common facial vein, which ends in the internal jugular vein. The side of the neck is divided into two triangles, posterior and anterior, by the sternomastoid muscle. The posterior triangle is bounded below by the middle third of the clavicle, anteriorly by the sternomastoid muscle, and posteriorly by the trapezius muscle. The anterior triangle is bounded above by the lower border of the mandible, posteriorly by the sternomastoid muscle, and anteriorly by the middle line of the neck. It's further subdivided into several smaller triangles. These are the digastric triangle, the submental triangle, the carotid triangle, and the muscular triangle. The digastric triangle is bounded by the lower border of the mandible from above and by the two bellies of the digastric muscle from below. It's occupied mainly by the submandibular salivary gland and the facial artery. The submental triangle is bounded by the anterior bellies of the digastric muscle of both sides from above and by the body of the hyoid bone from below. Its floor is formed by parts of the mylohyoid muscles. The carotid triangle is bounded by the posterior belly of the digastric muscles from above, the sternomastoid muscle from behind, and the superior belly of the omohyoid muscle in front. It contains mainly the termination of the common carotid artery and the beginning of the external and the internal carotid arteries, in addition to the related nerves and the internal jugular vein. The muscular triangle is bounded by the superior belly of the omohyoid muscle above and lateral, the sternomastoid muscle below and lateral, and the middle line of the neck medially. It contains the infrahyoid muscles only. This is the posterior triangle. These are the muscles of its floor, which are, from above downwards, the splenius capitis, the levator scapulae, and the scalenus medius. These muscles are covered by the deep fascia derived from the three vertebral fascia. The triangle has also a roof, which is formed by deep fascia, which is part of the investing fascia of the neck, extending from the sternomastoid to the trapezius muscles. The fascia of the roof is removed to expose the contents of the triangle. The nerves in the posterior triangle are seen to appear at the posterior border of the sternomastoid muscle. These nerves belong to the cervical plexus, brachial plexus, as well as the accessory nerve. These are the cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus. This is the great auricular nerve passing upwards on the surface of the sternomastoid towards the ear. This is the transverse cutaneous nerve of the neck, running across the sternomastoid muscle. These are the supraclavicular nerves, which run downwards towards the clavicle. The lesser occipital nerve will be seen on the opposite side of the specimen. This is the spinal part of the accessory nerves, emerging at about the middle of the posterior border of the sternomastoid. It runs downwards in the fascia of the roof of the posterior triangle to disappear under cover of the trapezius muscle 5 centimeters above the clavicle. It supplies both the sternomastoid and the trapezius muscles. These are the trunks of the brachial plexus. The details of the plexus, as well as the subclavian artery, will be seen more clearly on the other side where the clavicle has been removed. This is the external jugular vein passing downwards on the surface of the sternomastoid muscle. It leaves the muscle to pass in the posterior triangle to end in the subclavian vein. This is the inferior belly of the omohyoid muscle, crossing the posterior triangle to disappear deep to the sternomastoid. It shows the intermediate tendon that leads to to the superior belly. This is the origin of the sternomastoid muscle from the clavicle and manubrium sterni. The sternomastoid is now reflected to show the structures deep to it. This is the internal jugular vein. This is the scalenus anterior muscle with the phrenic nerve running vertically on its surface, the intermediate tendon of the omohyoid muscle, and the transverse cervical artery. Note that the suprascapular artery in this specimen arises from the third part of the subclavian artery, and therefore it is not an anterior relation to the scalenus anterior. Now we are on the right side. This is the sternomastoid cut and reflected. The spinal accessory nerve is seen passing from under cover of the internal jugular vein to pierce the deep surface of the sternomastoid. It leaves the muscle and crosses the posterior triangle parallel to the fibers of the levator scapulae muscle. This is the origin of the cervical plexus, where it arises from the upper four cervical nerves. The cervical plexus gives off muscular and cutaneous branches. This is the lesser occipital nerve running upwards parallel to the posterior border of the sternomastoid. This is the great auricular nerve. These are the supraclavicular nerves. This is the descendens cervicalis, which joins the ansa cervicalis. This root of the ansa comes from the second and third cervical nerves. The other root of the ansa cervicalis, which contains fibers from the first cervical, comes through the descendens hypoglossi, which is a branch of the hypoglossal nerve. These are the three trunks of the brachial plexus and the subclavian artery passing between the scalenus anterior in front and the scalenus medius behind. This is the upper trunk. This is the middle trunk. This is the lower trunk in company with the subclavian artery as they cross the first rib just behind the insertion of the scalenus anterior muscle. This is the subclavian vein passing just in front of the insertion of the scalenus anterior muscle into the scalene tubercle of the first rib. This is the transverse cervical artery. It arises from the thyrocervical trunk and runs in front of the scalenus anterior to enter the posterior triangle. This is the suprascapular artery. It arises from the third part of the subclavian artery and runs in company with the suprascapular nerve. This is the suprascapular artery and suprascapular nerve on their way to the upper border of the scapula. This is the submandibular region. This is the submandibular salivary gland occupying the digastric triangle and extending from the angle of the mandible to the level of the mental foramen. The facial artery is seen attached to its posterior end and continues between it and the lower border of the mandible. The artery then crosses the mandible at the anterior-inferior angle of the masseter muscle to enter the face. The submental artery arises from the facial artery just below the mandible and runs forwards towards the chin. This is the facial vein crossing the surface of the submandibular gland. This part of the gland is its superficial part. It has a deep part which is smaller and lies deep to the mylohyoid muscle. This part will be seen on the opposite side of the specimen. This is the superficial part of the submandibular salivary gland showing the facial vein on its surface. The submandibular lymph node is also seen on its surface. This is the mylohyoid muscle. It's deep to the submandibular gland. This is the anterior belly of the digastric, superficial to the mylohyoid muscle. The mylohyoid muscle forms with the hyoglossus muscle the floor of the digastric triangle. The mylohyoid muscle is triangular in shape, having a horizontal upper border by which it arises from the mylohyoid line of the mandible. It has a free oblique posterior border around which the submandibular gland curves to form its deep part deep to the mylohyoid. The medial border of the muscle is attached to a median raphe which extends from the symphysis mentae down to the body of the hyoid bone. It's supplied by the mylohyoid nerve and forms the floor of the mouth, and so called the diaphragma oris. The flexion of the mylohyoid muscle exposes many important structures. This is the geniohyoid muscle, extending parallel to the middle line from the inferior genial tubercle down to the body of the hyoid bone. It's supplied by the serous cervical through the hypoglossal nerve. Reflection of the geniohyoid exposes the genioglossus muscle, which extends backwards from the superior genial tubercle to the front of the root of the tongue. It's an important muscle as it protrudes the tongue and prevents its base from falling backwards and obstructing the airway. This is the hyoglossus muscle. It extends upwards from the greater horn of the hyoid bone to the side of the root of the tongue. Its superficial surface is related to the lingual nerve running on its upper part and to the hypoglossal nerve on its lower part, while the deep part of the submandibular gland and its duct lie in between the two nerves. Notice the submandibular ganglion suspended from the lingual nerve. It's very small and shows postganglionic fibers passing to the submandibular gland. Notice also that the lingual nerve curves round the submandibular duct, where it comes lateral and below and then medial to the duct. Both structures then proceed forward between the genioglossus muscle and the sublingual gland to reach the floor of the mouth. Border of the hypoglossus. Notice the styloglossus muscle passing to its insertion into the side of the tongue. This swelling present under the styloglossus muscle is the root of the tongue. This is the stylopharyngeus muscle together with the glossopharyngeal nerve closely related to it on their way to enter the pharynx. This is the lingual artery, and it disappears deep to the posterior border of the hyoglossus, just above the greater horn of the hyoid bone. Reflecting the hyoglossus muscle exposes the lingual artery as it lies deep to it. This is the second part of the artery. This is the middle constrictor muscle of the pharynx, lying deep to the hyoglossus muscle. This is the styloglossus muscle as it arises from the styloid process. This is the stylopharyngeus muscle, also arising from the styloid process. The glossopharyngeal nerve is running close to its lower border. This is the stylohyoid muscle, which arises from the styloid process and runs directly along the upper border of the posterior belly of the digastric to get insertion into the body of the hyoid bone. This is the intermediate tendon of the digastric, which is kept in place by a fibrous loop attached to the body of the hyoid bone. It connects the posterior belly with the anterior belly. The stylohyoid muscle and the posterior belly of the digastric muscle are supplied by the facial nerve. The stylopharyngeus is supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve, whereas the styloglossus muscle is supplied by the hypoglossal nerve.
Well, this is the end of part 1 of the anatomy of the head and the neck. I hope we shall see you again on another film. Thank you and goodbye.